evening and welcome to Direct Line. I'm your host, Terrence Mikas. He's served in the United States Congress as a certified public accountant. He's written a book entitled Unaccountable Congress, addressing what he sees as reckless spending in Washington. And he's been an avid pro-life supporter fighting for the rights of the unborn. But when he became president of the Albanian American Civic League about a decade ago, Hudson Valley resident Joe DioGuardi was thrust into a role that has taken him to the front lines in his stand to fight for those who are being oppressed. Tonight will be your direct line to former Congressman Joe DioGuardi as we discuss his recent trip to Kosova, Yugoslavia, and find out what the situation is really like there. Joe, it's good to see you.
Nice to be back.
Just before we go on, I want to again welcome our Westchester County guests that are joining us for this month, and Rockland County guests, and of course, Dutchess, Orange, Ulster, and Putnam. We always are glad that you're here with us. You've been fighting for causes out on the front lines with energy that has been amazing to your pros and your opponents for years. But this one's been different for you, hasn't it? I mean, the atrocities that you've seen. I know the pro-life issue and the partial birth abortion has been a strong thing for you, but this has been a tough one for you, hasn't it? It just kind of exploded on the scene.
Well, I brought this issue, the issue of Kosova and some of the most egregious human rights violations.
You say Kosova because it's no longer Kosovo, as people say.
That's what the Serbs use. It's really Kosova. The Albanians call it Kosova. And they don't believe it's part of Yugoslavia, by the way.
Yes.
They're going for their own state. In fact, that's one of the reasons I brought this nice bumper sticker over there, Independence for Kosova, the only way to peace and stability in the Balkans. Okay. This issue is not just for the Kosovars, it's for peace in the Balkans, and the Balkans is of vital interest to the United States of America. But Terrence, I brought this issue to Congress in 1986. It's an unbelievable story. You know how congressmen raise money at birthday parties? Well, on my first...
Hey, today's your birthday too, right?
It is.
I don't just want to say happy birthday to you, but go ahead.
But on my birthday, my first birthday as a congressman in 1985, some Albanians who came with one of my friends, another ethnic group, overheard my father speaking Albanian to his younger sister. And it was amazing. They came to me and said, "How is your father speaking Albanian?" And I explained that while he was born in Italy, that 500 years before, his people, my people, fled the Ottoman Turks because they didn't want to be part of an empire that would take away their Christian religion and do so many other things.
And at that time, though, you were going to Congress to fight for other things. In your mind, you weren't thinking this. How long did it take you to say, you know, this is a cause that I really think I want to throw myself into, because the commitment is big time?
Well, it didn't take too long, because the next day after that birthday party, 20 Albanians from Kosova came to my house in New Rochelle to tell me about a place I never heard of, Kosova. And when I went to Congress, I found out that very, very few senators or House members knew about it. Tom Lantos did, Hungarian Democrat, born over there. He knew it. Ben Gilman knew it because he was international relations, but very few people knew it. At that point, I was working actively on the Soviet Jewry issue, working with Tom Lantos on the rights for the people of Tibet. And then what I did in talking to Lantos is say, why can't we add this one to the Congressional Human Rights Caucus?
And what they usually say is, Joe, I mean, I know it's an important issue, but how much can we spread ourselves? Many of the critics say, how far can we go into all these countries and be the peacekeeper of everything?
So you have to lobby your own members. So I had to make the case, because these Albanians every week would send me horrific pictures. You think
back in 85,
back in 85, 86.
Of people just sliced.
Once Tito died in 1980.
Explain to Tito who Tito is.
Tito was the head of Yugoslavia. He was the one, half Croatian, married to a Serb, who saw that ultranationalism would kill Yugoslavia, so he created a balance. Fearing that the Serbs were the most nationalistic, he gave the Albanians status as what they called then an autonomous province.
Right.
Equal in status to Serbia. Right. Equal vote in the 8-person confederal presidency, everything. As soon as Tito died, the Serbs came in and took it away. And then finally in 1989 with Milosevic, actually walked in with tanks and took everything away from Kosova. Its parliament, its schools, its hospitals. For 10 years, Kosova, until the bombing, was an apartheid, was another Warsaw ghetto in the middle of Europe.
Let me ask you something. But at that time, when Tito died, what caused him to think that the Albanians, was it just history upon history of teaching that the only pure race is their race? What caused him to think that the Albanians were going to be any threat to them?
It wasn't the Albanians that were the threat. He knew that the Serbs would be a threat to the Albanians, because he had seen that even before World War II, there were ultra-nationalist Serbs that were saying, we must take over Kosova, we must integrate the Albanians into our society and literally treat them not as a separate culture or nation, but as a subgroup of the Serbian state. And Albanians resisted that because this has been their land for 10,000 years.
Yes. When you talk about Congress and lobbying, that was in 1985. That was a long time ago. Only recently have people in the United States even thought about any atrocities going on over there.
It's like East Timor. People are not aware of all the problems until they hit the news.
But you've been trying to run, you ran for Congress a number of times. This is what I find so interesting. And you won, and then you were defeated in a couple primaries.
Right, and I've used this issue.
You've used this,
human rights.
But
it's important.
But the thing that's interesting is that some people lose that election, and they just kind of go on to something else. In your heart, it seems that there's such a fighting spirit. You're doing this now, a lobbyist, non-paid,
as a citizen,
for the Albanian American Civic League,
right,
traveling all over the country and the world to get this issue going. And not too long ago, back in May of 1998, May 6th,
right,
you actually went before the Senate and pushed them, just a few months after the bombing, to say this is a NATO issue.
Right.
You're almost prophetic in that.
Well, I felt that our foreign policy was failing so miserably that I had to get in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House. In fact, I did both. But it was in the Senate that I faced off with Senator Biden, who had not seen it this way. In fact, he became a big champion of the bombing, and it was really that hearing, I believe, that turned the corner.
Let's take a look at that clip, and then we'll set it up here that you were kind of really pushing into him, saying, what are we doing? We're not consistent. We're saying we're a human rights country, and we're not addressing it. Either we are or we aren't.
Exactly.
Let's take a look at that clip.
We have today in Kosova some of the most egregious examples of violations of those human rights. In fact, Senator Biden, during that hearing that you held, and it was a wonderful hearing, it was the first time that you got all groups together to talk about the problem, I had to fly in reports from the Council on Human Rights from Pristina and other places, litanies of horror. I don't have to do that today. You know why? All you have to do is read your own U.S. country report from the State Department. Here it is, the 1997 edition. But if you read the last 5 years, you can't believe the litany of horrors in here against the Albanian people of Kosova. What are we waiting for? How many people have been killed and brutally tortured and detained and disappeared? Every criteria they use has been violated. Why is there such a disconnect between those egregious violations and our professed adherence to human rights when it comes to foreign policy? Is there another deal in the wind? Perhaps you didn't ask the right questions to Ambassador Gelbard. Are we placating Russia for some reason? They're always there supporting their first cousins, the Serbs. That's where the Serbs came from in the 6th century AD, from the Ukraine. We know they're blood brothers, or at least blood cousins. They're always there supporting them. But what has Russia done for us in Iran, Iraq, and China, and so many other places? They don't support us. Why are we giving such deference to Russia? Why are we even considering a contact group at this point, including Russia? This is an issue that should be led by the United States of America in the NATO milieu, without Russia. This is where it belongs. That is what solved Bosnia. And the only reason today Bosnia is not like Kosova, Mr. Chairman and Senator, is that we have troops there. Who are we kidding? When are we going to wake up?
And of course, you know, many of your critics will say, you claim to be this strong conservative, yet you want to use our army to go to every little war across the world. They say that's inconsistent.
No, because you have to look at our priorities. And when you're talking about the Balkans, and you're talking about Kosova, which is just north of Macedonia, and Macedonia has attracted the interest of Turkey and Greece, imagine this war spilling over into Macedonia, where there are 1 million ethnic Albanians, and then having Greece and Turkey at each other's throats, not just on Cyprus, but in the Balkans, on Kosova. There was a very good reason for us to do this. Not only the immorality of the genocide. Ask our Jewish brothers and sisters who have said never again, never again, never again for 50 years, and ask them whether or not they would have tolerated this kind of thing. And many of them came to the aid of the Kosovars once they saw it for what it was, which was a premeditated, barbarous plan by the Serbian state against the Albanian people, genocide.
Okay, we're going to take a break. When we get back, we're going to talk a lot more with Joe DioGuardi. He's just come back from Kosova. We'll be back. Welcome back to Direct Line. Our guest, Joe DioGuardi, the head of the American Albanian Civic League and, of course, former congressman. And the clip we just showed when you were testifying before the Senate was in a way prophetic because you really took them on. And before that time, though the bombings had just started, it kind of catapulted you into a national presence. You were on CNN, Fox, all over.
Right.
People started really hearing that there are many Albanians over there, the atrocities that were going on, but there's many Albanians here that were really fearful right here in the Hudson Valley.
Oh, yeah. We have in Westchester County alone about 10,000 Albanian-American families, mainly in Yonkers, and many in Putnam and in Dutchess County. And we've got refugees, because I remember when they came here, they called me. They know who I am. Back in 1990, I took Congressman Tom Lantos and Senator Bob Dole there to send a shot across Milosevic's bow.
And he didn't want you there. At that point, he was really upset. You were actually banned from the country, weren't you?
They passed a law in the Serbian parliament that I could not come back to Kosova. In fact, I just returned just a few weeks ago.
Yes, that's why we have you on here, because it's very fascinating to our viewers. What we're going to do is put up a number and a website that people could get in contact with you if they're interested at all in helping the cause. It's right up there, the Albanian American Civic League, area code 914-762-5530. And the website is www.aacl.com.
That's in Ossining, where I live. Ossining is the international headquarters of this independent volunteer lobby. And if anybody calls, I'll give them a copy of the bumper sticker and perhaps some the only way to peace and stability in the Balkans. And we have other things we can send them to.
When I want to just talk about you going over there, but first I want to ask you when the actual settlement, and some people say it really wasn't a settlement, that Milosevic was just thrust into that and forced into it, but when a lot of the Albanians were coming back into their land and their homes, they were putting atrocities on some of the innocent people in the land they had just come from. How bad was that? Was it true?
You mean retaliation against Serbs? Well, Albanians, by their nature, are not people who treat other people badly. They are a very moderate,
Do you believe
secular,
that any group is?
What I could tell you...
Let me just ask, do you believe that any group is innately wicked?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, so you're not just saying...
And the Serbian people are good people, too. They were misled, as Hitler misled the German people, with controlled media, false information. This is what Slobodan Milosevic did, using a Stalinist form of communism. He's also an ultranationalist, the worst of both forms. He poisoned the minds of the good Serbian people. When the Albanians...
Most of them were just spending their time just trying to get their food on the table.
Absolutely. But when the Albanians returned, what they saw was so incredible. They saw their houses burned to the ground. Family members still laying on the floor, burned to a crisp.
And it's horrible.
I mean, houses became crematoria. And you can
imagine how they felt. But you're not justifying looking at 10 farmers sitting there not, just doing their own work, not even interested in this, just getting shot.
No, absolutely
that's
not.
What happened.
And anybody whose hands are clean, that they're Serbs, the Albanians have told me time and time again, stay here. We want to be a multi-ethnic state. We want to be a multi-religious state. But we do know that there was a premeditated plan in Serbia. And it was the
army... And you brought that out in the Senate hearings also.
In fact, there was a memo we found in 1937 written by the mentor of Milosevic. His name was Vaso Tribilovic, entitled The Expulsion of the Albanians. There was also a similar plan for Jews. There was this sense in the Serbian nation for years that it should be cleansed of everyone but Serbs. Very much like Adolf Hitler. Now, we didn't see it that way. Now, Albanians come back...
Why didn't we see it that way? We didn't think it could happen again?
I think, number one...
enough in terms of the national scope?
Number one, but number two, Americans don't hear much about the Balkans. So this individual was able to get away literally with murder for years, and our State Department didn't have enough pressure here. Don't forget how foreign policy works on anything. You need interest groups here to pressure the Congress, the House and Senate, into action. And when we formed a lobby representing the concerns and interests of 500,000 Albanian Americans, that's when we started to get some action.
And that's when you started to get a lot of publicity, and you've been all over. You've been lobbying many places. One of the places you lobbied was the Pope.
Yes.
You went up and were able, because of your visibility now and because of the atrocities, the Pope actually met with you.
Yes.
And you were able to present to him a number of things, including a book. We have a shot of that, not a clip, We have a shot of you meeting with the Pope. We're going to put that up now, and then you can explain it for our audience, okay?
That was a recent trip on my way to Albania to see the refugees in the camps. We decided to visit with the Pope and tell him about the Albanian people.
Here it is. There's the cross, and Christ on the cross between you. It's an image. It's almost a kind of a interesting image of him hanging between your two heads there.
But look at that book. That book has the Albanian flag and the Israeli flag. That book makes the case, and we handed out 10,000 copies of that book in the Jewish communities worldwide. The connection between the Jewish people and the Albanian people. Many people didn't know that every Jew who fled over the border of Yugoslavia into Albania and Kosova, because in those days the Italians were occupying it, was saved. It's the only nation in Europe that could say that every Jew was saved. 2,000.
What did you talk to the Pope about? I know that you're planning, he's invited you back, and you're also planning a multi-religious prayer service.
The new Archbishop of Kosova is Bishop Mark Sopi, and he's invited me and my wife Shirley to return to an outdoor mass on October the 3rd to pray for the future of Kosova.
So you'll be heading back there in a matter of weeks.
And I invite Albanians who want to join me to call me, and perhaps we can make that a public pilgrimage back to Kosova.
What is the state right now in that country?
Okay. It's amazing. I was there 9 years ago, couldn't get there because of Mr. Milosevic. I walked there back to the Grand Hotel where Congressman Lantos and I saw them beating up the people who came to see us. And now you see the outdoor cafes, the people walking on the streets. I mean, everything is not all well in Kosova because you see many houses that are burned, especially in the rural areas. But you could feel the freedom in the air. The people are happy. They are optimistic. They want their freedom, and they want self-determination. They want independence.
Well, I don't want to be too melodramatic here, but there's one family, of course, that isn't happy. We're going to put a shot of it. A whole family wiped out. You said at the grave site there, 45 people, members, 6-month-old babies, just killed.
Pregnant women.
Let's just look at that, and we'll talk about that.
7 of his brothers.
Right there.
I met with the remaining brother, Rifat Jashari, and this is the family in Drenica where the whole campaign by Milosevic started in earnest in February of 1998. This is just after Ambassador Gelbard made that big mistake calling the Kosovo Liberation Army a terrorist group when it had never been listed. And we had to challenge him in another hearing with Congressman Gilman. But that gave Milosevic the green light to go in and attack the Jashari family because they were one of the families that formed the Kosovo Liberation Army.
They didn't attack them. They wiped them out, man, woman, child, and killed them.
And leveled the compound, the houses. It's just barbaric. But this was repeated over a period of 18 months in every part of Kosovo.
So why are people smiling and happy now? Is the pains go away so easy?
Well, you know, look at the phenomenon that just happened. We've never seen this in the world, where every refugee went back as soon as possible to a country. In Bosnia, almost 1 million refugees have still not returned. In Kosova, everyone's returned. Why? These people have a strong attachment to their land, their culture, their language, and they want now to live in a free, democratic society.
And we'll be right back with Joe DioGuardi. Stay with us. Welcome back to Direct Line. We're talking to former Congressman Joe DioGuardi, and we've been talking about the whole situation in Kosovo and the transition that's taken place. And you said that there is an air of hope there, but so many families, so much atrocity, so much killing, and still the situation is not settled down. I mean, Russia, you're still not sure what they're thinking. I mean, they've been fighting you, as you said, in the Senate hearings. They fought all the way up till they're fighting still.
Right, and even now they're trying to define a separate zone for themselves, which would literally undermine the whole security of Kosovo. Look what it did to Bosnia. The reason why many Bosnians didn't return was because of the Russian presence, so we have to be very careful of that.
What do you think that the Russian presence is? Would they just feel that because they're so united through history that they just will never in any way?
Well, in the case of Kosovo, we know that there were mercenaries from Russia called the Tsar's Wolves that joined with these paramilitary criminals that were let out of jails in Belgrade to do these atrocities. And they were told, take everything you want, take the booty, the loot, the gold that they have on their bodies. So they were there, in effect, for personal gain. Now, imagine coming back and seeing your houses destroyed, all the things taken, families dead. You can imagine the feelings that Albanians have right now against the Russians.
But right now you went there and you went into some refugee camps. You really dealt with people. There were smiles on their faces. We have one picture of you in a refugee camp. And we're going to take a look at
With
that,
the
explain
kids.
it to the
Many
kids.
kids, don't forget.
And the kids are the people with hope.
Oh,
I mean,
and
they've
if you
seen
see
such
the-
atrocities at this point.
And if you see the youthful nature of the population of Kosova, it's the highest birth rate in Europe. So the average ages of the whole country is in the mid-20s someplace.
Okay, here's the picture.
It's a country with a future.
Where exactly was this?
This was in a refugee camp in Albania. Don't forget, the refugee camps were in Albania and Macedonia.
Right.
This was a trip before this. I could not get into
Yes.
Kosova, but here I went to Albania to see them because I wanted to see firsthand what was going on and report back to Congressman Gilman, as I'm doing now with this trip. In fact, in a couple of days, I'll have my report done. I'm going to see Ben Gilman, and I'm going to urge him to have hearings on Kosova, the future of Kosova.
And that's Congressman Ben Gilman, who
Yes.
represents the 20th Congressional District.
Yes.
And,
Well, we
and
see
he-
we have a big problem right now because the UN is not operating fast enough. The United States has deferred to the UN now.
But a lot of people in Congress, many of your colleagues, many conservative colleagues, do not like the UN. It seems like you made a switch on this with this particular
I haven't. I've always said we should not have this issue in the UN. It should be in NATO. And that's ultimately what happened. But now what's happened, because Clinton has been criticized so heavily, especially by my colleagues, the conservative Republicans, for having spent so much money on the war, we had to take the lead.
Do you disagree with your colleagues on
Well, I
this?
disagree because they're
So you
mixing up two
support the
issues.
president?
They mixed up two issues.
You support the president?
I supported the president on Kosova, but I've criticized the president, like my colleagues, for reducing our military strength over the years. And what they're saying is, how can we have these arenas in Kosova and East Timor if you keep reducing the military
Because
budget?
we can't fight a real battle if we had
Exactly.
to.
So we've got to do that too. But they're not mutually exclusive. You've got to do both.
You want people, of course, in the Hudson Valley, from Orange and Ulster and Dutchess, Putnam, Rockland, Westchester, all those counties, if they have an interest, to contact you,
Sure.
to be involved. The process
Get more
isn't done.
information?
The situation is not done.
It's not
The
done.
situation is in the process. We have a number and a website we're going to put up again in about 20, 30 seconds. When they call, what will they get? I mean, they have someone that, what is it?
Well, when they get to the website, they'll see a very well-developed site that has the background of Kosova, the background of how I got into this issue, all the trips that I took to the Balkans, and there is a fax number, a telephone number, and also some books that we've put out that they can actually download. The book that I referred to with the Jewish flag and the Albanian flag can be fully downloaded by them and read. So they can get a lot of information, but feel free to call me. We have tapes we can send them
There's
if
the
they're
number,
interested.
762-5530, and the website is www.aacl.com. And do you meet together, or how does it work?
Well, our board meets periodically, and every now and then we have rallies in Washington. We had this spring probably a half a dozen rallies in front of the United Nations. So we try to increase public awareness by doing these things.
And in about 40 seconds, so have you left the local political scene, the fights with Hillary Clinton coming into your town and the whole thing?
Well, I'm ready anytime. No, right now I've got enough to do, but I've never closed the door to public service. And if that opportunity arises again, I'll be ready for it.
And will you support Hillary Clinton at this point, or do you support Rudy Giuliani, or do you support anyone else? I mean,
Well,
in the U.S. Senate race?
I wish we had more candidates running. Obviously, I can't support Hillary Clinton, and I'm looking closely
Why
at
is
Rudy
that?
Giuliani. But look, he took the liberal line. We know that he's not for the protection of life of the unborn. So I have great mixed emotions about Rudy Giuliani, but I could never even consider a Hillary Clinton candidacy. I want to see a good conservative come up and run.
Okay, I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank all you for joining us. Until next time, I'm Terrence Mikas. Next week, Lee Marengoff from Marist Poll. Good night.
Westchester.
Hello, welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Mary Calvi. Each week on Newsmakers, we take an in-depth look at one of the week's top news stories. Today, the crisis in Kosovo. NATO airstrikes have pounded the Serb area in Yugoslavia. President Clinton is still ruling out sending ground troops into Yugoslavia, but on Capitol Hill, even some members of his party think it's time. Westchester Congressman Elliot Engel says airstrikes alone won't stop the ethnic cleansing. He wants NATO troops to go into Kosovo. And And so do our next guest, former Westchester Congressman Joe DioGuardi, and his wife, Shirley Cloyes, an Eastern European expert and author, both Albanian Americans. I know you fought to get intervention in Kosovo for years. We'll be talking about that. Good to have you here, Joe DioGuardi. Shirley Cloyes, nice to see you. And
it's nice to be here, Mary. But first, let me say about Shirley, she's an honorary Albanian American.
Yes, I understand that now.
Yeah.
And you also an Italian American with Albanian ties.
Well, you know, today there are tens of thousands of ethnic Albanians in Italy. They believe they treat themselves or they feel they're Italian, but like my father, their people came, my people you can say, from Albania 500 years ago. The year was 1488 when the Ottoman Turks overran Albania. And Albania, at its closest point, is only 60 miles from Italy. The port of Durazzo, and Brindisi or Bari is 60 miles, and tens of thousands of Albanians fled across those straits in the year 1488 and still reside in Italy today in 51 villages in the Calabria area where they still speak Albanian. In fact, it was in Westchester County on my first birthday party as a congressman in 1985, September the 20th, at the Nursing Club in Rye, that several Albanians who I didn't know, who came with one of my supporters, discovered my father speaking Albanian to his youngest sister. The next day, 20 of them were in my house in New Rochelle telling me about a place called Kosova, which I never heard about.
Well, you've heard much about it lately, and I wanted to just go back to what Dan Griffin said from White Plains. He's a veteran leader, and he's very concerned that ground troops going in will create another Vietnam War, and put U.S. troops in a lot of danger. Shirley, what do you think about that, and what are your concerns?
Well, I'm very concerned, actually, by the continual invocation of the Vietnam War by many, many analysts at this point. Why? Because probably the only consensus we have nationally in this country is that we don't want another Vietnam. But what we mean by that, you know, differs so widely. This country was so deeply divided by that war. I happen to have been in the anti-war movement as a college student. My father supported that war. It means so many different things, and it's not the apt comparison that we need to make. This situation in Kosova is not about inappropriate intervention on the part of an external force. The situation in Kosova is about a genocidal war being conducted by a man who is all too similar to Adolf Hitler, who has marched through one country after another, starting with Slovenia in 1991, going to Croatia, going to Bosnia, where he killed over 300,000 people and produced 2 million refugees, is now back in Kosova. And the problem is, if we don't stop this man now, he will continue on this path. So there's a great deal at stake. And I don't believe that the introduction of ground troops is going to lead to the kind of result which I understand a Vietnam veteran would would be concerned about and care about. I don't think that's
I'd
going
like
to
to
be
make
the outcome.
one point on that, too, as a Vietnam-era veteran. There is one point that should be made about Vietnam and what we're doing now. We don't want to repeat what we did in Vietnam, where the enemy had the will to win and was going all the way, and we were trying to get them to surrender to us. We see that happening again. I mean, if we're going to start this thing as we did, and I think President Clinton made a very good case, we have to now win this. And we have to put the resources there. We have to arm the Kosovo Liberation Army, commit the ground troops. We cannot afford to lose this coming out of the 20th century into the 21st. It would ruin the credibility of NATO and the United States.
I think what we're hearing from of the concerns is that Yugoslavia has rough terrain. It's very well known to serve troops, and if you bring in ground forces from elsewhere in the world, they may not know where they need to go, and there's a danger.
Mary, there's a key. The Kosovo Liberation Army is already there. They know the terrain. We were very pleased to see that today the New York Times reported that the KLA is actually advising NATO troops on the ground. They're telling them where the SAMs are. They're telling them where the concealed tanks are. So there is already a force on the ground that is pro-American, pro-Western, and is fighting to defend people who, as we know, are being exterminated and expelled en masse.
Specifically,
that is available there before any U.S. troops go in.
Specifically, what they're doing is they're advising the NATO air forces, so with their mobile phones, to come in, to hone in on those Serbian troops on the ground, which is a good collaboration. I hope now that we do what we did in Bosnia, Don't forget, we armed the Croatians in Bosnia.
Yes.
We didn't get Mr. Milosevic to the peace table at Dayton just by bombing him from the air. We had a good army, the Croatians, freedom fighters themselves. We armed them, and this is what worked. Now, why can't we do that again? So before we even consider NATO troops and U.S. troops, let's give the arms to the Kosovo Liberation Army. They're willing to die for freedom. They see what's happening to their... They've seen it for years. We're seeing it for the first time. This has been going on for at least a decade.
So why hasn't that happened?
Well, it hasn't happened because public opinion is not well informed on this issue. But you can see the polls changing before your eyes as people see the outrageous barbarism of Slobodan Milosevic. The polls are now changing. They certainly now, we have a majority of people who support what the president has done so far, the airstrikes. I mean, before this, that was uncertain too. And now we can see more and more people resolving that, yeah, we cannot lose this. And now that we see Americans that have been captured, abducted, we're saying, hey, wait a minute, we can't let this guy get away with this. So now I think you're going to see American opinion change in the direction that we cannot end this century with pictures and photos and people reminiscent of Nazi Germany.
We're taking a look at some of the destruction, some of the airstrikes that have gone on in the region, and you mentioned what President Clinton has committed. Today he committed 3 additional Navy warships, an attack submarine, a destroyer, a cruiser, all sent to the region, a dozen more stealth fighters. That brings the total of U.S. aircraft to 220 out of the 400 NATO war planes. Is that enough when we talk about equipment that needs to go to the region, or does more need to be committed?
I'm not a military expert, but I do know that the escalation of the military effort is absolutely imperative. You know, a few days ago there was a lot of hand-wringing within the NATO alliance about were we going to, you know, proceed to phase 3. We absolutely have to, and I think we should make no distinctions. For instance, we talked about not bombing the presidential palace where Mr. Milosevic resides with his Rembrandt on the first floor. I find this positively obscene in light of the fact that there are now 600,000 people that are wandering around the Balkans searching for, you know, refuge. And we also should be seriously considering not having a discussion within NATO, but proceeding with bombing the television satellite communication system. Because,
Totally controlled by him.
yes, Milosevic, Joe is right, has wielded his own tyranny over his own population through the instrument of the television set. That's how he began his wars. That's how he whipped up this nationalist fury based on a platform of anti-Albanian racism before he marched into Bosnia. So we should be proceeding with this, with all this back.
For those people who don't know how this began, can you give them a simplified version of what is going on, why this is going on?
Yes.
What century would you like me to start
Yeah,
with?
this is difficult.
Well, we don't want to go back that far.
Right.
The case for history favors the Albanians, but you'd never understand it if you listen to the Serbs. And since they've controlled the propaganda machine, don't forget, the Albanian people were suppressed by the worst forms of communism for the last 50 years after World War II. You had the worst communist dictator in Albania, Enver Hoxha, who made Albania into a concentration camp, and you had another worst form of it in Belgrade. And this is what you're seeing with Mr. Milosevic. He was trained very well by his predecessor since World War II. So this is a problem because what has happened while the Albanian people were suppressed, Serbian academia, Serbian politicians, Serbian journalists were running around the world revising Balkan history. So now we are trying to make up for that. Shirley and I and others are trying to use our time. We're volunteers. We formed this Albanian American Civic League as an advocacy, or as an advocate, a voice for the Albanian people in Washington, the legislative and executive branches, and around the world. We travel often. So we now have to make sure that the American people know what this is all about. Now, rather than go back to the last century or to World War II, let's just focus since 1974. The Constitution of Yugoslavia was affirmed in 1974, and it gave Kosova an equal vote with Serbia in the 8-unit confederal presidency of Yugoslavia. This was not a vassal state of Serbia, like the Serbs say. When Tito died in 1980, he had kept everything pretty well calm. That's when Mr. Milosevic and his cronies rose to power. And that's when we had the problems. They started to oppress the Albanians brutally. By 1989, 600,000 of the 2 million Albanians were put through police process in one way or the other. Our State Department knew that. In 1989, he marches into Kosova, before Slovenia and Croatia, takes away everything the Albanians had, their parliament, their jobs, their schools, their hospitals, and since then he went to Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and now he's back for his biggest prize, Kosova. This man is the worst of two worlds. He's an ultra-nationalist Nazi. We know that because the way he's bonded with the ultra-nationalists in Russia, like Mr. Zyganov, and he's a Stalinist communist, the last vestiges of it in Europe today. And we know that because he controls everything, the press, the army, the schools. So basically, we are facing a regime here which is medieval. When he talks about 14th century, because he wants to claim, you know, Kosova based on some war they lost in 1389, President Clinton's right. We cannot go back to medieval values. That's where he is. We have to bring Europe, a free Europe, a united Europe, a prosperous Europe, a democratic Europe, into the 21st century with us, and it has to be without Slobodan Milosevic and a Kosova that's an independent state. The Kosovars want democracy. They look to the West. The Serbs in this regime, they don't want democracy. They want communism. They're looking to Russia.
We're going to talk more about this topic in just a moment, but we're going to take a quick break just right now, and we'll be back with much more of Newsmakers right after this. And welcome back to Newsmakers. Our topic today, the crisis in Kosovo. And our guests today are former Congressman Joe DioGuardi and author and human rights activist Shirley Cloyes. Good to have the both of you here. The mass exodus of refugees from Kosovo continued this week, but President Clinton has approved $50 million in additional refugee aid. The move came as hundreds of protesters hit the streets of Manhattan Wednesday in support of strikes against Yugoslavia. News 12's Jackie Hyland reported the story.
It's a chant that's been heard on the streets of New York City for days. Hundreds of Albanian demonstrators, including children, carrying signs and pleading for help for their people.
I have family there. My mother was born in Kosova, and it's just it's terrible the way that they're doing to people over there. And it's just like Hitler did to the Jews.
Edward Bakay lives in White Plains. He and his father, who was born and raised in Kosovo, were just two of the dozens that traveled from Westchester for the rally outside the UN. It was a rally that many from the Jewish community, all too familiar with the horrors of genocide, supported.
If the Holocaust means anything, we have to remember that silence can kill.
This is not just another protest. For these people, it is an urgent cry for help to save their country and the thousands of Albanians that have been forced from their homes, and even worse, slaughtered.
They're not even telling about what's going on, so the women down there and the girls, they're stopping teenage girls, they're keeping them behind, separating from, you know, them from their families, and you tell me, what are they keeping them behind for?
We feel the tragedy deep in our souls.
It's a tragedy that NATO is trying to end with airstrikes, but now many in the Albanian community are hoping that NATO will intensify its campaign to include ground troops. In Manhattan, Jackie Hyland, News 12 Westchester.
And there is much concern from families right here in Westchester who have relatives who were living in Kosovo or who now have fled to neighboring countries. And if we can talk about the refugees, I know that you met with refugees earlier, and what is the concern for them? Is that there are no homes now, their villages have been destroyed? I'm sure this is a very tragic situation for them.
Refugees have been streaming over the border from Kosovo to northern Albania for some time now, and Shirley and I went last August and September to Albania to see what was going on. We wanted to visit also the camps of the Kosovo Liberation Army to see what was going on there, to see how they were organized, but mainly it was to visit the refugees. So we hired a helicopter from Tirana, the capital of Albania, and flew over these magnificent tall mountains in Albania to the northern part. And it was, on the one hand, disgusting to see so many people just dispossessed.
What we're watching now is refugees of just yesterday and the day before who are really there without, sometimes some of them don't have shoes on their feet.
Mary, the situation is horrifying. I mean, they were just told to leave their houses and go at gunpoint. They were marched to trains, and it's very, very shocking and sad to have to see the specter of trains going across Europe again. getting rid of those who, you know, would otherwise be exterminated on the ground. The cities are in flames. All of the archives of the Albanian nation are being burned. There are dead bodies everywhere. The litany of horrors is incredible. And one of the things that I'll never forget, when we were on our way to Albania, and the trip that Joe just described, we met with Emma Bonino, the head human rights commissioner for the European Commission. And she said at the time, when I asked her, she said, we don't need to deal with the humanitarian side, disaster relief. We have that in place. What we need now is a political solution so that we don't have to go to that point. I'll never forget her words, because no one anticipated, we could have told them, but no one anticipated the scope of this tragedy. So while the UNHCR is there, and Catholic Relief Services is there, and World Vision, and Red Cross, and the list goes on, Save the Children, they do not have all of the supplies, and certainly they don't have the temporary housing in place. I learned today that the numbers are now up over 600,000.
What they don't have is, right now, the management in place. I know that the money will come, and but just throwing a lot of money at it without figuring the organization and the management of this massive effort will not work. And I'm hoping that some of the best minds we have in the United States and the world are dealing with that. You can imagine the hygiene problems, the feeding problems. You're going to have hundreds of thousands of people sitting on hills. It might rain any time now over there. These train trips that Shirley referred to, it's just, this is Nazi Germany all over again. 3 babies were born on the trains. 3 people died. In the Times this morning, it was reported. This is human pictures that are just absolutely outrageous.
The two of you are from Ossining, and there are many families that we've spoken to who have relatives who they have not been able to contact. And that is so frightening for a family not to know whether their family members are alive.
They have no idea.
Where are they? And I'm sure that you've been hearing from families
well, we get
all the
calls
time.
day and night from Albanians all over the country. We have a website, and they picked that up, but Albanian Americans know Shirley and me very well because of the efforts in the past 10 years. And out of desperation, they're calling because they think that I have some contacts to find out where they are, and it's so sad.
Very difficult situation.
Don't know.
The two of you have been committed to this situation for a long time, trying to get U.S. intervention and NATO intervention. You met with the Pope, and I wanted to talk about that because you said he really understood your cause and really knew what needed to be done.
Well, you know, Pope John Paul II is from Eastern Europe, from Poland. He understands communism very well. He understands the Albanian people very well. In 1993, when all the churches were finally opened in Albania, don't forget it was one of the only atheistic states under their form of communism, I was invited to be there at the renovated cathedral in Skopje that was made into a gymnasium by the communists. And here this beautiful church was brought back to life. The Pope came and invested 4 Albanian cardinals. They had been in communist jails, some of them, for 20 and 30 years. And they had survived, but many had been just killed, like priests were, who wanted to continue religion. But we went, on our way to Albania, we went to have this kind of semi-private audience with the Pope to make the case to him about the Albanian people. We brought this book that describes that the Albanians are the only ones in Europe that saved every Jew who managed to get across their borders into Kosovo or Albania. And Pope Paul had known about this. And he knows the Albanian people very well, and he reassured us that he was doing everything possible. But don't forget, he's not a political leader in the way Bill Clinton is, although the Vatican is a temporal state as well as a spiritual state. There's only so much the Pope can do, but he's trying to use his moral authority as much as he can to get the right result for the Albanian people. He knows these are Albanian lands from ancestral times. Albanians that were there, they were the Illyrians for 10,000 years. The Serbs came there in the 6th century AD, and now they're trying to say that this is their Jerusalem. It's not going to work with this Pope, I can reassure you that.
And I understand that a number of Jewish leaders are coming to your aid, trying to support your cause, of course, because this is certainly reminiscent of World War II. Tell me about that.
Well, I think, you know, the Jewish community tragically knows a great deal about genocide, more than many Americans, and they certainly know what it means for the world to be silent in the face of it. And, you know, at the end of the Holocaust, we, you know, hear the cry that has been uttered now for many, many years, never again, never again. The problem is never again is beginning to happen again, and the Jewish leadership in America can see that, and so they have come out in solidarity with the Albanian community to demand an end to the genocide.
I think it's such a shock to many people that decades after Hitler, we're seeing this again.
Yes.
And I would imagine that for many people, it's very difficult to really understand what is going on, and that this is this is reality.
Right.
So what would you say to those people who have not come to terms with what is going on and who've not really focused on this issue?
Well, first, I cannot fault them for not focusing on it or not knowing what's going on. This is Eastern Europe. We in America don't really get into that geography, that history. It was only as a congressman that I began to understand what the Balkans was all about. But on the human level, I think we have to understand what America is all about. And we have not built a wall around America when it comes to freedom. This country, the word liberty is very important. 213 years ago, there were freedom fighters here who decided that they wanted liberty, and they said, Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death. This is what the Kosovars are saying. This is what the Kosovo Liberation Army is saying. So I would say to the American people that this affects us all. As Martin Luther King said, if there is injustice anywhere, then justice is threatened everywhere. So we cannot allow the 20th century to close on a note that another two-bit dictator, another Adolf Hitler, has his way, and we have just tried to deal with him by appeasing him. I think he's now shown his true colors. We didn't deal with him properly when he walked into Kosovo in '89, or when he walked into Slovenia and Croatia and Bosnia, where we lost, by the way, Mary, 250,000 civilians, innocent people, because we acted 2 years too late. President Clinton knows that. We must act now with all of our force.
We're quickly running out of time, less than a minute left, but how do you think this is going to end?
My feeling is that we will apply the force that we need to finally eliminate Slobodan Milosevic's awesome capacity to do harm to innocent people. That's going on right now.
But once we do that, then we're going to have to go back to the political realities that inform this conflict to begin with, and that is we're going to have independence for Kosovo. It is the major unresolved national question in the Balkans. All of the other former units of the former Yugoslavia that Joe has mentioned are now independent, and it is time for Kosovo to be independent as well, because you cannot have autonomy under conditions of genocide.
And every referee should be returned to Kosovo.
Shirley Cloyes, Joe DioGuardi, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Mary.
And keep us posted on the developments. And I'm afraid we are out of time, but thanks for joining us today here on Newsmakers.